Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this SCORE lecture on organization. My name is Kristina Garsten, and I'm chair of SCORE. Most of all, I'd like to welcome Marie-Laure Djelic. Marie-Laure is a professor at ESSEC Business School in Paris, and she will talk today about Born to Diffuse, towards the new generation of diffusion studies. Now, I will venture to give you just a very brief recap of Marie-Laure's research interests, but I will not even dare to say that this is a complete picture, because she's a very busy woman who has made contributions in many fields. As I said, she's professor of management at the ESSEC Business School, where she was also former dean, and now she is chair of the department. She got her PhD from Harvard University, and she has been at Uppsala University for the Kerstin Hesselgren visiting professor. She has also been a visiting professor at Stanford, and also a recurrent guest here at SCORE throughout the years. And her research interests are in comparative business history, Americanization, and more generally in globalization and transnational professional communities and new emerging forms of governance. She has also edited a number of very influential volumes in the field of globalization and governance, for example, together with Sigrid Quack and Kerstin Salin Andersson. And those are, by now, volumes that most of us know and make use of, and not least here at SCORE. She's also one who looks very closely at the formation of professional communities around new forms of governance, and also at the very forms of governance themselves, what they are, how they are diffused, and how they are implemented in various parts of the world and in different kinds of activities. Marie-Laure, in brief, has made a great impact on the field of management, the underlying conceptions of management, new forms of governance and professional communities, and diffusion. And diffusion will be the topic for today's lecture, so I think I'll let you yourself continue from there. We are delighted to have you here.
Thank you very much, Kristina, for this very generous introduction. I want first to start by saying a big thank you to all my friends here at SCORE for today and tomorrow. I'm very grateful to be here. I've always, as you know, enjoyed coming to Sweden in general, to Uppsala first and then to SCORE and then to both. And this is, I think Sweden has become my second home in some sense, particularly intellectually. So I'm extremely happy to be here, and I want to thank you again for this. So yes, I'm going to talk about diffusion. In fact, I started my my life as a scholar working on diffusion and thinking about diffusion, both empirically and theoretically. For a while, I kind of seemed to have gone away from it, and started working, as Kristina has been saying, on governance, and particularly transnational governance, and the ways in which rules of behaviors, particularly in the economic field, are being constructed at the transnational level by groups that we've called, together with Sigrid Quack, transnational communities. And for a while it seemed that I had moved away from the preoccupation for diffusion, looking into other things conceptually, until I realized that maybe actually what I was doing there, working on governance, was maybe actually also about diffusion. And that's what I'm going to try to convince you about today. In fact, this is what this presentation is about. I don't know if you'll buy the argument. This is very much a work in process. It's a mix of this theoretical reflection about diffusion that have been going back to in the last 2 years or so, and of a major empirical project that I have, and that actually by now Adrienne and Christina are going to be very tired of, because they've heard about this empirical project quite a bit. So I'll talk about it at the end, and I'll try to show how it helps me conceptualize this new perspective on diffusion that I'm going to propose to you. So since this is really very much work in progress, I mean, you're very welcome to, come in at any point. I know that the logic is that I speak for 45 minutes and then we have questions, but I'm also very happy if you want to interrupt that, we do it in a more kind of back and forth kind of way. So just a few words to set the scene and to kind of try to explain the strange title, which probably some of you will have recognized at least part of it. So obviously the title comes from this tradition in international business, talking about the born global firm, where essentially the intuition is that internationalization doesn't have to be the way we always used to think about it, that is a firm starting local, starting national, and then moving on progressively as it has acquired a certain maturity on its national or local market, moving on progressively to international markets, and then looking into different types of strategies for that internationalization process, which has been what the international business literature has been doing in the 90s and forward. So precisely in the 90s and forwards, some people came up with the idea that that might be not the only way to think about internationalization, and that maybe there are firms that are born global. And basically, here I put some of kind of the classic definitions of the born global firm that went back to some of the work in McKinsey Quarterly, Journal of International Business Studies. Those are really the classic text, founding text, where the idea is that a business organization is a born global organization when from inception it seeks to derive significant competitive advantage from the use of resources and the sale of outputs in multiple countries. And basically there's, the Nordic tradition of international business has been also quite big about, kind of contributing to that tradition. So I basically, stole the idea from there, and I propose to twist the term and to use this intuition for our thinking about diffusion, for our thinking about the diffusion of forms, ideas, and practices, more generally speaking. So basically, the idea here is that our contemporary world may be characterized by many situations in which what we witness in terms of increasing similarity, increasing convergence, maybe, or proto-convergence, may not be, is actually not necessarily the result of the diffusion of locally invented ideas, forms, and practices, which is what a lot of diffusion studies have been mostly about, taking an idea, a form, a practice that has been invented somewhere locally, and then looking how it then translates and transfers and translates in other places, but that actually there are, in the contemporary world in particular, a lot of born to globally diffuse ideas, forms, and practices, and that therefore we may have to rethink, in a sense, our tools to think about diffusion, to include also those born to diffuse ideas, forms, and practices. So this is really essentially the kind of basic intuition, conceptual intuition behind this paper, to kind of make it clear and try to summarize it. So if I represent it a bit more by a little drawing, in a sense what I'm proposing is that we might have to think about a radiating model of diffusion a bit. This would be not very good in drawing, so I'm trying to kind of make sense of my conceptual idea here in a way that is maybe not very adequate. A radiating model of diffusion as opposed to a linear and stepwise kind of model of diffusion. That would be the idea behind this presentation, which at this stage is not yet a paper. It's supposed to it should have been a paper by now, but not it's not yet a paper. So then, from this basic idea, which is really what I'm going to try to put for the discussion between us here, here is how I'm going to organize the rest of the talk. First, I'm going to actually take us back a bit to my own reading of diffusion studies and where they've been and what are kind of the, in a sense, the similarities and differences between diffusion studies. And I'm going to then ask the questions of, if we take seriously this proposition that I just made, how does that imply, how does that impact our conceptual ideas about diffusion? Obviously, the next step when you've said that is, what are some of the methodological consequences also, once you have this understanding of diffusion and diffusion studies, you know, what are the types of methodologies that you need to think of if you're going to try to look at diffusion in that way. And in order to do this, I will use one of my empirical projects, as I mentioned, which is the project that I've been developing on the Atlas Economic Research Foundation. So I will then give you a bit of sense of that project at the end. So if I go back rapidly to diffusion studies, and again, I'm giving you really a very synthetic, very rapid, my own perspective on what we need to think about in terms of what we know about diffusion from the various types of studies that we have had so far and the different types of perspective we've had so far. If you think about increasing social similarities, the fact that we do things in the same way in the social world, is obviously a key puzzle for social scientists in general. I mean, one could even argue that this is the starting puzzle of social science. The social science is about that. It's about trying to find regularities in behaviors and trying to make sense of regularities in social science. So, this is, I think, one of the key puzzles that has been preoccupying social scientists ever since social science was born somewhere between the 18th and 19th century. Okay? When you think about that, there are essentially two broad ways to account for increasing social similarities. One is what I call a modernization or functionalist kinds of arguments, and I will go into more detail what I mean here. And the other one is the one that we will be more specifically interested here, and that's obviously the diffusionist kinds of arguments. Okay? So what do I mean by modernization and functionalist kinds of argument? Basically, the idea here is that the same cause will generate the same effects across multiple and varied contexts. So the intuition here is a bit like a bee stings, another bee stings. The two events are absolutely unrelated, okay? They are just explained through the parallel nature of both bees. So if we translate that in social terms, basically similarities will stem from adaptive or evolutionary kinds of mechanisms in contexts that are becoming increasingly similar to each other. So for example, if you think about decreasing fertility rates in society that are becoming, moving towards the organic type of solidarity according to Durkheim rather than a mechanical one, well, basically this can be explained in very unrelated terms in each society, just simply by looking at factors that are inherent to this evolution and that generate those decreasing fertility rate. Things like urbanization, things like education, things like women working, all those kind of elements associated with these types of evolution will generate the same types of behaviors in different societies, irrespective of any connection between them. And you can have this same argument, obviously, at the societal level, but also at the organizational level or at the individual level, etc. One way to illustrate a bit this is to look at this picture. Okay, so we can have a very functionalist understanding of umbrella use. I didn't expect it would be raining, but works well. So the kind of functionalist account of umbrella use is that we each open our umbrella in a bit as a bit of a kind of reflex type of reaction. The same cause, the rain, generates in us this spontaneous opening of the umbrella. Okay, and this is kind of a simple modernization and functionalist argument. Then we can actually make things a bit more sophisticated, and this picture is slightly more complex. I'll explain, and the picture becomes more complex when you know about the context. So this is a picture that is taken in Japan after Fukushima, the Fukushima disaster, and after actually a lot of discourse has been constructed and diffused and built about the fact that, you know, after such a disaster, rains are highly carrying a lot of the radioactivity, thank you, and therefore that if you're, you know, taken under rain, it might be really bad for you. So in fact, you know, in the case of rain, not only will you have kind of the spontaneous modernist functionalist argument playing here, but you'll have actually a whole lot of stuff, social constructed stuff, that will reinforce this type of, you know, similarity in behavior or convergence in behavior. So we're moving here closer, obviously, to some kind of diffusionist perspective on the use of umbrellas in that case. And, you know, the latest stage is this, and this is actually a picture of the opening of the London Paralympic ceremony in 2012. And here, obviously, this is a stage umbrella opening, okay? So there's, you know, a completely social construction of the fact of opening umbrellas, and the similarities of behavior has really nothing anymore to do with simple reaction to, you know, kind of a neutral context. This is really a very imitative type or diffusionist type of process that has been scripted completely socially. So this is a bit, you know, the ways in which I would like to think of the continuum, in a sense, between modernization types of arguments and diffusionist types of arguments in social context to try to explain social similarities, social behaviors. It's, you know, it's a bit of an allegory to try to understand that we have actually a fair amount of variability possible between one and the other. So moving on now more to diffusionist kinds of argument, which obviously in our fields, particularly in sociology, in management studies, have been over the last 20 years or so quite important perspectives on social similarities. Not that the modernization functionalist argument is gone, it is there still, but I think that the diffusionist types of stories have been really having a lot of impact, so I'm not turning to those. So the diffusion argument, I mean, one very nice text to go back to is obviously Gabriel de Tardin, who's really a bit of the grandfather of this diffusionist argument, a French sociologist who was a bit the competitor to Durkheim on the French intellectual scene at the time. And Gabriel de Tardin, in a book that he wrote in 1895, called The Laws of Imitation, said, all social similarities with social origins are the direct or indirect consequences of imitation under its various guise. Imitation through costume or fashion, imitation through affinity or obedience, imitation through education or socialization, spontaneous and irreflexive or else self-conscious imitation. So imitation as the basis of similarity, of convergence, and imitation implies obviously diffusion, okay? Diffusion of behaviors, diffusion of forms, diffusion of practices. So this is really, in a sense, the kind of founding text of the diffusionist schools. Obviously, people like Latour has used Tarde a lot. From Latour, Barbara Czarniawska, and a lot of, the people writing in those traditions are really taking their cue here from Tarde. So Tadek goes very, when you read the whole book, you know, he goes really to an extreme here. He says, really, there's nothing that cannot be traced somewhere. So you can, you know, go after the flow of ideas, of forms, of practices, and you can always, in the social world, find a source of that behavior in another behavior that was either directly or indirectly imitated and therefore diffused. And you know, I put up here some examples that are well known. Obviously, the kind of the religious pantheon of the Romans we know is kind of obviously diffused, imitated from the Greek one, and you have here kind of the you know, correspondence between the different gods of those two pantheons. And obviously, and we'll talk about it, that there have been adaptations and transformations, but you can certainly trace one religious construction back to the older one. That's very clear. Another one that maybe we don't think so much about, and is a nice one, is the same type of process of diffusion or imitation that you find between the Roman mythology and the Roman religious, in a sense, again, pantheon, and Catholicism, actually. And if you look, for example, at the mythology of death, in both cases, you can really make a complete, you know, parallel with, again, adaptations, transformation, but you can certainly trace here again the influence of ideas, the influence of practices, the influence of forms even. So that's, you know, the kind of starting point for the diffusionists to argue from. Now, and so therefore that's in a sense the kind of common background of diffusionist arguments in general. Okay, diffusionist arguments start from where modernization and functionalist arguments do not. Okay, so they start from the idea that everything we do socially speaking, or a lot of what we do socially speaking, is actually about social processes. It's about mechanisms of looking at each other and taking from each other, diffusing forms and practices, putting them into different contexts and maybe transforming them in the process, but nevertheless there's always this social connection, which obviously is very different from the modernization argument. Now I'm going to go into a bit more of a focus on the different types of perspectives, or families of perspectives of diffusionist arguments that we've had so far, and that we can find in our literature, both in sociology and in management studies. You know, I'll stick with those two disciplines because that's the ones that I know better. So the first well-known type of diffusion perspective is what I would call diffusion as epidemiology. And so diffusion as epidemiology are basically about tracing the spread and possibly the institutionalization of given practices across a large or relatively large population. So we take an organizational form, we take a practice, you know, corporate governance code or whatever you want, and we go on and we try to measure how, you know, try to measure the extent to which this practice, this form, has been spread and to a degree institutionalized, but we'll get back to that, across a large number of companies, across a large numbers of countries, across a large number of individuals, etc. You can, again, decline it at many different levels. So one of the kind of original texts, in the sense that is a bit, you know, a founding text here, conceptually, is the text of Everett Rogers, which many of you probably are familiar with, on the diffusion of innovations, where Rogers is basically looking both at the mechanisms, really, at the reasons and the mechanisms for the diffusion of new ideas, innovations, new ideas and practices. And the pattern, the conceptual pattern that he outlines there has been used by a lot of people working within this tradition of diffusion as epidemiology. And this notion of diffusion as epidemiology, you can actually apply it from medicine, really, obviously, from tracking the spread of viruses and sicknesses, to the spread of fashion, okay? So it's really from in all kinds of empirical fields, you can really have this perspective. So, you know, this is this kind of great variety. And again, you know, some of the interesting contributions here is not only about the documenting this diffusion mechanism, the fact that we are doing things similarly because things are diffusing, okay, but also documenting the maybe variability of mechanisms in different periods of the diffusion process, okay, so where you have early adopters versus late ones. The Talbot and Zucker one is very famous for that in our fields, where you actually see different types of mechanisms at different periods in the diffusion process. The practice itself, the thing that gets diffused, most of the time in those types of study is relatively a black box. It's a bit taken for granted, okay? So we take a code of governance, or we take a fashion, management fashion, whatever it is, and we kind of, you know, if we have the same word in one context and in the other, we kind of take it that this has been diffused, okay? So the practice itself is relatively a black box. There's not much focus either on the actors behind the carrying of the practice, or the, you know, those that activate the diffusion channels. We're just really interested by a practice starts somewhere and it gets, you know, through multiple linear processes diffused in multiple other spaces. And we want to document that too. Obviously, methodologically, this will mean mostly quantitative types of methodologies, cross-sectional, event history, quantitative methods of different kinds. And, you know, so this is the Rogers model, with this notion of the diffusion of innovation, and the possibility of having different phases, and for those different phases having maybe different mechanisms of diffusions, different reasons for diffusion. So this is I would call that the first family, and we still have a lot of very interesting, you know, studies that are being done in that vein, and, you know, I'm very happy with these types of perspective. I haven't at all worked from that perspective, but I find that very useful. There's another second family of diffusion studies, which I call here diffusion as a counter with embeddedness. And this is much more familiar to many of you, and in terms of the work you've been doing, and also to myself. So here the idea is the focus, the real focus of interest is the point of an encounter, okay? The point of an encounter between a particular practice and a particular context. So the focus is not so much on documenting the kind of broad spread of a given practice that is relatively unproblematized. The focus is rather to ask about what happens when this practice that was born somewhere else gets plugged into another context. So the thick context of reception, the peculiarities of the receiving context, and the impact of those peculiarities on the way in which the object is appropriated, the way in which it gets translated. So this is the notion of translation that gets introduced. We have to remember that Tarde already is, again, the father of the notion of translation, because in his laws of imitation, he has these two dimensions. He clearly says we should think about the diffusion process, but we should also think about the reception and the translation through the reception. So beyond this kind of interface between the object and the context, those studies have also been very interested and very focused, and you know, one goes with the other, obviously, with the paths and the channels of diffusion, which are often the paths and the channels of mediation and translation, okay? And therefore on things like carriers, things like mediators, and the ways in which they really adapt those practices to a given context. So obviously this is what Scandinavian institutionalism is all about, mostly. So this is also clearly present in the work of comparative institutionalists of different kinds. So Eleanor Westney, my own dissertation was all about this too. This is so the methodology here is much more qualitative. In-depth case studies are, again, comparative case studies. So very different in terms of methodological implications from the first one, from the first family. This is an image to kind of, illustrate the second family. The image really is the Creole. So the Creole language, I mean, for those of you who know French, bâti is a French word, and bâtir is the real word, you would say bâtir. Here you have this kind of weird thing where you can recognize French, but it's not French, it's kind of this strange feeling. So this is really the kind of image of the second family of diffusion studies. So there are obviously complementarities between those two families of diffusion studies. And again, if we go back to reading de Tard, he himself is the first one to underscore those complementarities. So imitation and adaptation translation, measuring the diffusion of practices on the one hand and exploring their contextual reinvention. Weirdly enough, you have actually very few people who have tried to bring the two methods together, really, and the two perspectives together, even though this would actually make a lot of sense. So if you take, for example, corporate governance codes, again, I'm going back to this, well, you have certainly the place for studies that will document this very broad spread of formal codes, okay? So we have certain kinds of very formal text that are being written in different local contexts, and you can show that actually those texts are related, and you can show that they are diffusing from one or two centers at most, okay? And some people, for example, my colleague Ruth Aguilera and her colleagues have done that. They've done a lot of quantitative type of work showing this diffusion over the last 30 years or so of corporate governance codes across the world. But then you also have very interesting studies that are very necessary and very complementary, but generally done by other people, where what you want to look at is the very deep variability with respect to the local inscription of those corporate governance codes, okay? The ways in which they are being implemented, inscribed, translated, adapted, used, etc., etc. So here I give one example of an interesting work that does that and looks at the case of Poland. And in the case of Poland, is basically looking at the different principles that are involved in all those corporate governance codes across the world in quite a formally similar way, and is looking at the ways in which in Poland different principles are being followed or complied with, while others are not so much being complied with. So, even though actually this guy uses quite a lot of quantitative methods still contributing actually to this translation notion, to the idea that if you plug in this practice in a different context, you'll have a very different translation, different implementation of that code. And you could obviously think next to Poland of Ukraine, of whatever other countries, Germany, etc., and do the same type of work. Okay, so you can see the strong complementarities between those types of studies. And again, most of the time, unfortunately, they are not connected. People are doing one or the other, but are not connecting them. So this is what we've had so far in terms of diffusion studies. I think that those two broad families with both their very clear and striking difference and different logic, but also they have high complementarity, have been things where we've had a lot of people contributing, and there's been really a lot of work on that. So we know quite a bit by now on diffusion of those two kinds, actually. Now I'm proposing that maybe we need to think about another generation of diffusion studies, and this is where I'm getting into more shaky grounds, I think, and where, you know, we can discuss. And I call it, you know, I had diffusion as epidemiology, I had diffusion as encounter with embeddedness, and now I call it diffusion as construction. So basically here what do I mean by that? I mean that there are an increasing number of objects, practices, ideas that are from the start in our world born to diffuse, and that born to diffuse at a transnational level. So, you know, I'm here listing only some examples: ISO standards, IFRS, Bologna rules, sovereign wealth fund guidelines, fair trade labels, copyleft license, Basel III, Millennium Development Goals, Global Compact. All those are from the start born to diffuse, and they are from the start constructed at the transnational level. So they are not easy to fit in either of my conceptual model of diffusion studies that I presented before. And somehow they pose a question, they kind of beg for something else. And that's what I'm interested in, okay? I'm interested in those objects, and I'm saying that from those objects we need to conceptually think about diffusion in a different way. So the implications of this multiplicity of objects that we have, and that obviously I don't need to tell people around this table how important in our life those objects are, because, you know, you've all been working on that and showing that. So the implications, I think, that's how I'm interpreting it, the implication of this explosion of these types of objects and of their diffusion, we cannot call it differently, I think, still, and the strong impact that those objects have had across many, many different contexts, is that we actually need to look in that particular case at emergence of those objects as diffusion. Emergence is diffusion, in fact. Okay, so that's why emergence as construction. And therefore we have to look at, and we have to do a longitudinal exploration of the emergence of the born to diffuse object and practice. The diffusion process, I argue, is inscribed in the construction of the object of the practice itself. And so if we are going to understand the success of diffusion, the future of diffusion, we have to understand the past, the history of the emergence of those objects. Okay? So this is really the implication, the conceptual implication I draw from this. And this obviously will call for, I argue again, this is again my propositions here to you. I argue that methodologically speaking, the consequences, what you have to develop is in-depth qualitative methods with a strong historical orientation focused on the emergence of the project, which has in itself the diffusion process. Yeah, okay, this is... So now I'm going to take the example so that hopefully this becomes a little bit more concrete, because I realize that remains a bit general at this stage. So the Atlas Research Foundation and the Born to Diffuse neoliberal think tank. So my practice here, my object that is born to diffuse is the neoliberal think tank. And Atlas is the born to diffuse, the kind of born diffuser, yeah, in a sense, the born diffuser organization. So the context for this research is my interest in increasing more and more, actually. I used to be a structuralist. I don't think I am anymore. So my increasing interest for the power of ideas, and in particular for the power of the neoliberal idea over the last 30 years or so, in the ways in which it has shaped the transformation of contemporary capitalism, but also the transformation of our societies, more generally speaking, beyond capitalism. And here, in fact, I'm using two quotes. I should have put the name in the first quote. ideas as shaping the course of history. This is actually a quote from Friedrich Hayek. Okay. And the next one, ideas as reorienting the course of public policy. This is a quote from John Maynard Keynes. So two prominent economists disagreeing on almost anything else fundamentally agree about the power of ideas in shaping our world. Okay? And so this is my starting point, my starting interest. The interest here focusing more specifically on the neoliberal idea and ideological revolution, as I call it, with a transnational reach. And there have been, quite a lot of work on that, so this is the background to my interest. So, strong ideological revolution with a transnational reach, which has had an impact on national policy making, as well as on processes and mechanisms of transnational governance, but also of everyday individual types of forms of governance. My argument in this story is that ideas with a transnational reach, or world model, if we use John Mayer's term, before they come to float around like neoliberalism does today, they have to be carried, okay? And this is really very much a diffusionist perspective. They have to be packaged, they have to be carried, and we have to understand that process. And this is what really kind of triggered my interest for Atlas, and you'll understand why. To summarize the kind of carrier story of neoliberalism, I didn't find better than, in a sense, a kind of this representation, which comes, is adapted from a very unknown paper by Hayek in 1949 called Intellectuals and Socialism, in which he actually proposed a kind of a programmatic strategy for the return of the free market idea back in fashion, let's say. At that time, obviously, the free market was not fashionable at all. Rather, state-directed economies were all over the place. So he was a liberal. Not, we wouldn't call him at that time neoliberal, but a liberal. And his idea was to try to bring that idea back. And basically, in that paper, he does something very interesting. It's interesting. He says, in order for the world to change, you have to change the ideas. In order to change the ideas, you have to have an ideological revolution, because today we are very far from this free market idea. And in order to have that ideological revolution, you would need a configuration with two dimensions. First, you would need to have a core of dreamers. He calls them utopians, okay? And a core of dreamers who will fight for the free market idea, intellectually speaking, no matter what, and no matter how difficult it might be to try to impose it in the context. And this actually he had created 2 years before by creating the Mont Pelerin Society, which he was the founder of. And the Mont Pelerin Society in his architecture is really this core of liberal utopians. But he said those guys are not going to be able to do much if they are not relayed, if their work is not relayed by a second layer of actors, which he didn't call carriers, but we would, in our diffusionist perspective, call carriers. That a second layer of what he calls second-hand dealers of ideas, which is even worse than carriers, I guess. So, not the very smart guys, not the ones who are producing the ideas, but the ones who are really kind of busy out there diffusing those ideas. At the time when he was theorizing this, he was not thinking at all about think tanks, and one of the reasons was that there were no think tanks, and that actually, arguably, and this is what I try to show in some of my some of the papers that come from that project, this theorization that he has is the reason why we have think tanks today. Okay, and I'll try to explain how and why. So amongst the second-hand dealers in ideas, he gives all kinds of things, of labels, journalists, professors, novelists, novel writers, artists, all kinds of people that will be kind of relaying those ideas. So he has this very clear architecture in mind of carriers and diffusers. But interestingly enough, you can see that this core here is already in his thinking completely transnational, and that the second layer is also from the start, very much connected beyond local and national boundaries. There's something missing in the architecture that he was thinking of, and again, it's not by chance, because it did not exist then, and this is something which I will focus on. I will not focus on the Montpellier Society. I've done work on that before. I will not focus on think tanks themselves. A lot of people are working on that. I'm going to focus on this organization here that I put at the boundary between the core and this second layer. That is called the Atlas Research Foundation, and that was created in 1981 precisely with the objective of expanding this second layer through the proliferation, the multiplication of neoliberal think tanks. Okay, it was created with that objective. And so this is really the core of this research project. So the role of this particular organization, Atlas, that has the specific status and function in transnational neoliberal architecture, I call it both a diffuser and an integrator organization. It has done two main things. First, it has diffused the neoliberal think tank as an object, as a practice, as an institution. It was actually built for that. It was built for diffusing that object globally. And the other thing it has done, and still does, is integrating this multiplicity of actors that it has helped create. Okay, so it integrates them and also connects them to the core, to the Montpellier Society. So a very interesting organization. So, you know, how does that connect with my conceptualization before? If we are going to understand the neoliberal think tank, then we have to understand the born to diffuse moment, the emergence of that model. And the diffusion, again, is inscribed in the emergence of the model. Okay? So this is really why I go back to the origins of that organization. So there's a need to explore the constellation of events around the construction of Atlas, which was the bearer of that diffusion project and which was itself born to be the diffuser. So the methodology, as a consequence, you know, logically, as I was saying before, is an historical case study that goes over the period 49 to today. Atlas is the object of that historical case study. I use all kinds of primary, secondary material, classical historical work. So I go fast on this, on the different sources that I use. So just a bit of the story for those of you who don't know it, because it's kind of a fascinating story, and hopefully it will help you connect a bit some of the dots that I've left open here. So we have a man very important in that story, Anthony Fisher, who connects with Hayek in 1945 and tells Hayek, "I'll do anything for you. You know, I agree with you. I agree with your ideas. I'll do anything you think is important to defend those ideas." And he tells him, "Should I go into politics?" And Hayek says, "No. Build a diffuser of idea. You know, work into this diffusion of idea argument." But he stays very vague. Few years down the road, this guy makes money first, and then once he, has made money producing chicken on a mass scale in Britain, so he's a big chicken mass producer, he opens up in 1955 the Institute of Economic Affairs. And the Institute of Economic Affairs, if you don't know, is actually is the first neoliberal think tank that we can call, as we can call it that way. And therefore is the blueprint for a lot of the story that will happen later, and has been very, very instrumental in bringing Margaret Thatcher to power in Britain. Okay, very, very instrumental organization. The first thing Margaret Thatcher did 5 days after she came in power is made the head, the kind of operative head of this think tank, a lord. To thank him for the services that he had rendered her. On the basis of this success, in the late 70s, Fisher moves on to the next stage. And the next stage is his idea of institutionalizing proliferation and, as he said, to litter the world with free market think tanks. So take this blueprint and explode it in a sense into one of those worldwide, born to diffuse model. Okay. And how would he do that? By creating an organization, Atlas, whose job it would be to be a neoliberal think tank entrepreneur across the world, so to diffuse that object at practice. Using the Institute of Economic Affairs as the foundational blueprint, and then, doing this. He gets the full support from the luminaries of the neoliberal movement, people like Hayek, Thatcher, who say things like, I applaud your aim to build on the success of the EA in Europe, America further afield. I believe it deserves the most urgent and generous support of all concerned with the restoration of the market economy as the foundation of a free society. So all this allows him to get money, obviously, to have Thatcher, Hayek, and all those people saying this is the thing you should do. And he creates Atlas, therefore, in 1981. So I'll go a bit faster here because I realize I'm getting beyond the time. So the Atlas has had four main roles since its creation. Okay, first, it has, in a sense, operationalized utopia. So it has disembedded the model of the neoliberal think tank from the early experience of the Institute of Economic Affairs. And therefore, it has created this kind of relatively generalized blueprint of what is a neoliberal think tank. Okay, and then it has taken that model and it has gone on and re-embedded it, bridging downwards, re-embedded it into multiplicity of contexts. So you remember this kind of first drawing of a star-like diffusion process. Huh? So it's not a kind of stepwise process, but it's a multi-directional process. The third role it has done is, at the same time that he was doing that, it was also trying to keep all those things together, because obviously you have, you kind of export this thing in all those multiple contexts. You have this translation process that takes place. You don't know how much the model will go away from what you were expecting at the start. So you have to keep all those guys together. So it creates a kind of hub, and it has all kinds of socialization mechanisms. It's really very close to our conceptualization of transnational community, in fact. So it has all kinds of socialization mechanisms by which it keeps those guys together and those different think tanks across the world together. And therefore, in the process, building and consolidating the transnational community. Another important role is that it connects this second layer, second-hand dealers of ideas, with the core, with the non-parent society, creating kind of this overall community. So this is, the role that it does. Here, a few more details on the first role, the operationalizing utopia. So if you go there, you will see the blueprint of the neoliberal think tank. This is a very clear description, formal description of what is a neoliberal think tank and how you can build one. So you take it and you go and you build your think tank. So it has, formalized that through the years. They didn't do that from the start, but it came and then it formalized it. Then it kind of, concretely went on the ground, targeted individuals and organizations in different countries, and, kind of helped them develop their own think tanks locally, sending money, seed money, and sending also knowledge, savoir-faire, and coaching, consulting, playing a kind of missionary role. And the result is that when there was, in 1981, about 5, 6, 10 at most neoliberal think tank in the world, connected with Atlas, today there are much more than, close actually to 500 by now, because every year you have more, so here I'm not going to go into that, but if you go, I can leave the PowerPoint and you can go, and we have built a map with one of my PhD students, and so we see this explosion of the neoliberal think tank across the world from 1981 to today. So conclusion, diffusion as construction. If we want to go that direction, if you think that it's worth it, and I'm very eagerly waiting for your views on this, then it will call for many more empirical studies with such a perspective on diffusion. Clearly there is a multiplicity of object practices that can be understood in that way, so the empirical material is certainly easy to find, and there are a lot of things that we could look at from that perspective. we need to go much more than, we've been trying in that project as we go along, but it's a really kind of a bit of a learning by doing process. So I think we need much more thinking about the methodological implications. So we need to, work more on the tools for this. And so what I'm proposing really is that we have to move towards a new theorization of diffusion, where the born-to-diffuse object or practice integrates, since the construction phase, both the epidemiology project and the embeddedness requirement. That's something I haven't spent too much time on, but it's very clear from the Atlas case that they actually, once the design of this kind of blueprint and the design of the ways in which they target different places integrates both this notion that you want to have a diffusion of the same thing, but also a preoccupation for the variability of context and the impact and the need to adapt to this variability of context. So the two things are very tightly integrated in this, and we see that in IFRS, we see that in a lot of those other born to diffuse objects in a sense. So this is my last slide. I propose therefore that we have had 3 lives of diffusion and diffusion studies. The kind of relatively simplistic by now, but it's a bit unfair to say that now, but relatively simplistic idea of convergence and connected to epidemiology studies and the mechanism of imitation. The more subtle understanding of partial divergence or framed divergence maybe, which is connected with the translation stories. And, here, I'm not sure about the terms here again, I'm trying what I would call a framed inscription. So construction is the mechanism here, where we are disembedding something, turning it into a born to diffuse object at the transnational level most of the time, and then re-embedding contextual appropriation as part of really the construction itself, national or local level, and at the same time, in parallel, inventing a new arena for embeddedness and progressive alignment, very often at the transnational and across context level, those things we call transnational communities, as keeping those things together. That's it.
Thank you very much. That was wonderfully inspiring. And also you gave us a very good overview of the field of research over the last few decades and where we are now and where we could go. So thank you. And before I open up for comments and questions and general reactions, let me give you some indication of how Marie-Laure's work has diffused. The fact is that tomorrow, and I didn't want to say this at the very start, to take sort of the space away from the SCORE lecture organization. But tomorrow she is being installed at Stockholm University as an honorary doctor in the social sciences. So we congratulate her on that, and it's just evidence of how well her ideas actually, they may be born to diffuse, but they certainly take root here at Stockholm University and Stockholm School of Economics, I should add as well, since SCORE is the host. And also the SCORE lecture organization itself may be a bit of a story of diffusion. We started it in 2007 as a way to sort of gather thoughts on the frontiers of organization theory and at an international level. So quite a few prominent speakers have been here. You're in good company. We had Professor Stuart Clegg from the University of Technology in Sydney come in 2007. We then had Professor Leon Friedstein from the University of California, Berkeley. And later on, Barbara Czarniawska, professor at Gothenburg Research Institute, was here. She's also part of our advisory board. And then Professor Peter Miller from London School of Economics. And now Marie-Laure Djelic. So this is the larger frame of diffusion of this idea of organization theory and its frontiers. Now, with that, I invite questions and comments to Marie-Laure's propositions.
I have to write the paper, so please help. Thank you for a very interesting lecture. I'm grappling with the logics literature right now, especially the most recent book, and trying to see how the institutional orders, I mean, they try to break with the diffusion studies and claiming these orders to be old, and then that the logics are put together at the local level by agents that are both embedded and free. And that's persuasive when you read it, and then I hear you, and it's persuasive when I hear you too. And I'm trying to get the things together and see about the logics of the professions or the religious logics. Are they then born to diffuse at a very much earlier state, and then put there as frames for sort of that kind of interaction between what is epidemiologically spread and culturally? But how do you get these things to fit, or are they just a different way of explaining? Because they make such a big statement about not dealing with diffusion studies anymore, but that's old and this is different. But I like the idea about this sort of master interpretive frames existing out there, being historically embedded. But I think that it's also related to this. It's not just something entirely different. So what's your comment?
I think it's an interesting question. Actually, Mike Lunsbury is the one who commissioned me this article. So. No, I didn't think about this in that way actually, but I'll try. I think that what is interesting in the types of objects that I'm really identifying here is the very strategic integration of this diffusion project in the objects themselves, which I don't think you have necessarily in some of those more traditional ideas or bodies of ideas, where you did not necessarily have this kind of projection, like I've tried to show it in the case of Atlas and the neoliberal think tank, where from 49 the projection of this should become a kind of born to diffuse practice or idea is there. It's conscious. It's there. So I think that makes for a slightly different object. I think. Okay, not to say that. Another way to answer your question is that there might be nothing ontologically identifiable in those different objects, whether they are born to diffuse or not. It may have to do with the way we look at them, So it might be that we can look at the neoliberal think tank from an epidemiology perspective. Obviously we can, it's very easy to do, Or we can look at it from embeddedness perspective, trying to look at the ways in which locally, this is being translated, used, etc. But we can also look at it from this kind of construction perspective, I think. So maybe you could look at, for example, Christian religion in all those three things, in all those three perspectives. And so what is important is not that the objects have this ontological property of being this or that, even though this is a bit contradictory to my first point. But, I think the two explanations would lead me to say we are talking about something different. Then the question is whether or not we should kind of bring it back to diffusion using the term, or, because I agree in a sense when I think after my presentation, I think you can see that I agree that the first two families, they're fine, they were fine, but we need to go beyond, So in a sense, I agree that it's old. But I agree with the institutional logic people on that. But at the same time, I think we cannot throw the baby with the bathwater, and I'm very happy to theorize it still as a diffusion process. But just we have to reconceptualize what we mean by diffusion process. So, but I could also call it something else, Yeah, I could just say, I'm not talking, I'm just forget diffusion studies altogether, and this is completely new and different. But I don't see it as being completely new and different in that sense. I see the capacity to build upon previous work in a smart way, rather than saying this is trash, let's move on to something else. I'm not sure I was very helpful here.
It's an ongoing reflection.
Yes.
All right, Mats, please.
Thank you. Very interesting. I was thinking a little bit about...
Take the flowers.
I have two more minor comments on my reflections on differences and similarities here. And I was, first of all, just a brief thought. Could you say that, for example, the huge consulting firms like Boston Consulting Group and McKinsey and so on around Harvard specifically would fit, in a sense, into your radiation model? Of course, they're born to make money, but it was, in a sense, the other side of the coin is actually that they're equally born to diffuse. That was one idea, one comment. The other one was, if I understood it correctly, you're interested in the success of diffusion as it is dependent on the process of emergence. Put differently, you suggest that we need to study these processes of emergence differently and more in detail in order to understand more about the success of diffusion. And then I was a bit, if you could elaborate a little bit more on that. We knew some about that. For example, if you include the number of stakeholders you include during these kind of processes, affects the diffusion afterwards. We have other results on, for example, the characteristics of the very models that you diffuse. Affects how much they diffuse, so if they succeed in a sense or not. Drawing from, for example, the studies of Honorary Doctor and so on. So that was my second point. If you could elaborate, how could you make a difference here? You spoke some of the organization of Atlas and so on.
Okay.
Yeah.
So on the consulting firms, this is a very interesting point. Actually, it's a very good point, because I myself worked a bit on consulting firms from a very embeddedness perspective. Diffusion with this focus on embeddedness, and I think here again I'm going to have a bit the same kind of hesitation between as I just had. Because on the one hand, you could look at the history of consulting firms as a move from really a kind of linear understanding of diffusion. Because consulting firms were what? Initially, they were American companies. They were American, locally born, carrying essentially American ideas to the rest of the world. First Western Europe, and then progressively other layers of the world. So you had a very clear ideas are born and practices are born somewhere, and then we diffuse them in different contexts. And then they bumped into, probably had this very beautiful view that the world would converge, and then they bumped into the complexities of contexts and then had to adapt and to translate and etc. But I think in the recent years, they have indeed moved to this born to diffuse model. So, and they have indeed moved to create ideas out of any context, in a sense, and have strategies that those packaged ideas that are being processed in, so that's starting to answer the second point in a particular way. And one of the things I insisted upon in the Atlas case is this disembedding of the Institute of Economic Affairs. So in order to build up this blueprint, you have first to disembed. So in a sense, the idea and the practice is not completely born global, okay? Because we can still trace it back to the Institute of Economic Affairs, which is British. But the interesting thing is that the blueprint is really completely disembedded, and so it's being constructed with this view of disembedding it completely from the British context and making it into this completely universalizable, something you can universalize package. And I think that consulting firms do function like that now, much more, definitely much more. So I think you could certainly apply it to that. So in the success of diffusion, indeed, I think that this disembedding process is a very important part, and this is where the self-conscious strategic engagement is very important. I think indeed this notion of identifying the relays, so maybe not the stakeholders, but those mediators, and the construction of those communities of mediators is really another very fascinating mechanism that you find in Atlas, you find in IFRS, you find in a lot of other cases, probably in ISO too, but so I think that there are indeed specific organizational processes that are connected to this form of diffusion process. Yeah.
Interesting. We move on, please. Thank you very much for this presentation.
I find that your emergence idea resonates a lot with a book that has been published a year or two ago by Powell and Paget on the emergence of organizational form. And their principal argument is that the emergence of organizational form, the uptake of an idea and the creation of an organization around it, is contingent on the overlapping of different networks and their co-evolution. And now I was thinking, your case is really great because you have kind of a master network strategist that does all these things for you. And I wondered, are all of this organization strategy bound to be successful, or are there networks that simply disintegrate because of whatever?
Yeah. That's obviously the very good and killing point, because you're very right. I mean, it would be very, very good to study failure, and that goes back also to your point. It would be wonderful to be able to study a case of failure. It's very difficult, as we know, methodologically, to study failure, because first it's difficult to identify failed projects when they're failed. You don't necessarily know about them. Something, a place maybe where to look for is maybe in the anti-globalization movement. I think that there might be very interesting places where you don't see it happen. This kind of, process, and the interesting question is why you don't see it happen. I mean, you have still those networks, but they are very disconnected in a sense. They don't manage to create a born to diffuse object or idea or whatever, and they don't manage to then spread it. So there are places where you could try to look for failed attempts. Well, I'm not even sure there are attempts actually in that story, in the case of the anti-globalization. I'm not even sure that they are there, because part of their anti-globalization is that you don't want to do this. There's kind of, again, a bit of an hesitation between globalizing themselves, but also saying we are all about wanting to be local in a sense, or different, or and calling for this difference. So maybe they're not even attempting that, so it's not even a case of failure. But I think it's a very good point. I think it's we could learn a lot from this, but very difficult to study. But yeah, I've been thinking about that quite a bit, but it's much easier to look at success than at failure. And this is really, the Atlas thing is really a case of success, definitely. Well, you see what I mean. Yes.
Thank you. Stefan?
Pity that we couldn't arrange this a week ago, because we have been working, studying hard the week here. The application that we had a meeting yesterday, I think Christina and I are part of this. We're working very hard. And I think it would have been made our arguments much clearer if we had. But we hope for the best anyway. So I think it's good to see that what we are doing here and been doing for so long is in the construction part here, I think. Most of the work. So that's good. And also, I think it's one thing that is interesting here is a lot of things are interesting. One thing is to what you're pointing at is maybe that sort of demystifying earlier arguments about diffusion. That is so mystical that they diffuse. There are pressure, there are institutionalization going on, and there are fashions, and things just happen because you have all these mechanisms. But here we have an argument that you're pointing at with this case, especially that nothing takes place without organization.
At least in those cases, you know, maybe I don't want to go beyond this. Being prudent.
Yeah,
but you
really focusing on there are actors that are doing things and they become successful or not because they organize in certain ways. And following that, focusing on that dimension, I think is maybe that's where we have the new dimension of the construction part, I think. And which referring back to other concepts that has been used to use falling to diffuse, which relates of course to buyers and others, that concept. Institutional entrepreneurs, I know that you don't like that.
But in fact, I am talking about institutional entrepreneurs in that case, yeah.
I mean, we have these concepts, and here we have a similar kind of actor, but from another coming in and making a deeper analysis.
Yeah. I think that's a very good point. I would say, and this is actually going back a bit to Matt's point, is the type of organizing that goes on is different. I think that probably in kind of the earlier models of diffusion with the kind of carriers and stuff, you do have organizing already. You have the kind of the kind of early consulting firm model of taking the multidivisional form in the US and then kind of packaging it and kind of spreading it across Europe. You do have organizing there. But I think that the nature of the organizing that goes on in this type of diffusion process, born to diffuse process, is different, and this is where Matt pushed me rightly, and I think we need to and I think I'm struggling still with this, to really identify what are the characters of that new form of organizing that generates this type of radiating diffusion rather than stepwise linear one. So I think that that's what probably we need to conceptualize much more and we will be able to conceptualize it if we have many different cases, so we have to first start, I think, with empirical cases, kind of compare them and kind of figure out what is similar, what happens always in those cases, and what, might be different in some. Okay, Patrick, please.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah.
Lovely talk. I'm really impressed the way you put us on the train with showing the history of diffusion study, and then you added your own contributions. Very, very good talk. Diffusion, as you kind of presented, and as you know, is a very general notion. And I really appreciate your attempt to reconceptualize it. And I was thinking here about a slightly different way of doing it, and would be interested to hear your ideas about it. And maybe we should even have different theories for different types of diffusion. For example, one would be more like innovation, when it's very clear that something is, so to speak, better than what we used to have. There is no doubt there is a kind of a scale or a standard against which we can measure what we introduce. So even before you start to diffuse it, so to speak, you know that there is an improvement. And that the model of diffusion in such a case would probably be quite different from a situation where you have like competing alternatives and in a sense diffusion of something which is not inherently in any way better than anything else. It's just one way of, like fashion would be the extreme example of diffusion of objects which do not really have any substantial advantage over what we used to have. They just look different. Whereas in innovation, it's clear that this computer is better than the others. And how they diffuse should, I guess, in terms of innovation, would be a different story than the fashion. And it seems like your case is something in between, as in most empirical cases, that this And I was wondering a bit about this born to diffuse, which others have picked up on a bit, that it somehow goes a bit stand in a contrast to your notion of construction. But maybe would it be one way to think about it that the objects are co-construction in a process?
Constructed to diffuse, in fact. It's not born to diffuse, it's constructed. Yeah, you're right.
You cannot start with one without the other, so to speak, because this is what I'm hearing you're saying.
Yeah.
So a much stronger relational dimension of diffusion and objects of diffusion. It seems to be what you're after.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, you're right. I mean, I kind of like, this is a kind of opportunist type of, twisting the word of born global. But in fact, it's not what I mean. Yeah, it's not born global. It's not born to diffuse. It's constructed to diffuse. Yeah, so it's because in the kind of born global notion, there is a notion a bit of kind of this functionalist and kind of modernization type of argument, which I'm very far away from. So I think that it rings well. The title sounds, because we know about the born global literature. Then on this kind of difference between situations in which something is obviously superior and something is clearly not superior. I'm not sure I would go that way. I'm not sure there is something like that. I am in the gray zone, indeed. I don't believe that anything is inherently superior. I think this depends on the perspective of the various stakeholders around the table, and that there will always be some degree of discussions around this, always, less or more, but there will always be some degree. So I don't believe in this kind of inherent. So I'm definitely in the gray zone. I'm definitely in a situation where you will always have fights around those born to diffuse processes. Definitely, both at the level of the construction itself and at the level of reception.
Then we move to Stefan.
Yes, thank you for a very stimulating presentation. I would like to ask you to expand on 2 points. And the first is the role of power and interests in diffusion studies, because I was struck that you managed to do the whole presentation without once mentioning power or interest at the same time as in the case study. So obviously related to power and interest. I mean, both in the kind of self-obvious way that financial resources are really important if you want to shape the whole organization field, but also more generally in the sense that some actors have the power to shape the environment in which they then act, and some actors also have the power to shape the behavior of other actors in that field. So some sort of, because
That's a very good point.
I get this far too harmonious story out of diffusion studies. My second point is, could you expand a little bit on what exactly is the thing that is being diffused, and is that different between these generations of diffusion studies? Are we talking about diffusion of rules, standards of various kinds? Are we talking about diffusion of organizational practices, or are we talking about diffusion of ideas, like because it seemed to me that in your empirical example, what is diffused is not primarily ideas, because the ideas are already there. You say, well, if you have these ideas, how should you go about? So
it's an organizational form. Yeah, so very, very interesting point on power and interest. Obviously, it's the ghost in the story here. It's all over the place, especially in my empirical case. I think it's taking the two arguments together, the two questions together. I think is interesting because, in a sense, if I'm thinking about this, in the kind of epidemiology understanding of diffusion, there's no power. This is really, we are in kind of this understanding maybe of an inherent superior model in a sense, and then basically this thing goes. So in a sense, we are somewhere in between the modernization type of argument and the diffusionist type of argument. When we start moving into the embeddedness models of diffusion, then we are in the situation of, you know, why would that model be superior to others, or why would that form be superior to others? And there are different discussions around the table, and there is partially, the result of that can be partial hybridization, or it can be resistance, or it can be decoupling. I mean, we know that. I don't have all those options around the table from that process of translation, etc. So here power is relatively naked power in the sense, especially in the work on Americanization that I've been doing. You know, we have a clear origin of ideas and practices, US, and we have receptions of those ideas, which are, you know, either more positive or more negative, but we know what power we are talking about, in a sense. Huh? It's quite naked power. I think the interesting mechanism in the last generation of diffusion stories is the neutralization of power, or the hegemonization of power, in a sense, I could call it that way. And this happens through, I think, this disembedding process. So when you disembed those models to turn it into universal practices or models, you are neutralizing them power-wise. You are going back to a certain notion of a superior type of practice, and you're kind of evacuating the power dimension, but you're turning it into an hegemony. So I think that probably this would be nice, actually. I probably will put this in the brief. Yeah, I think that's a very good point. So what's the thing that is being diffused? Anything, really. I think that it can be an organizational form, it can be an idea, it can be a practice. So in my case, it's definitely an organizational form. The particular case that I'm looking at is Atlas Diffuse is an organizational form, but an organizational form that has been constructed and embedded in an ideology, and then disembedded and turned into, you know, this kind of relatively neutral model that goes around, but carries, in fact, the ideology in the background. So it's very interesting, because they are really there to diffuse the organizational form model, but from the principle that the people to whom they diffuse it share this common ideology, and therefore are going to use that organizational form for that. But the interesting thing too is, and that's a story that, you know, has not been written, and that could be an extension of our project, but, you know, not now, is that there is definitely a story where more leftist ideologies have been kind of picking on this think tank model, definitely over the last 20, 30 years. My hunch is that definitely the think tank form model is the neoliberal one, initially, in the contemporary period at least, and that the kind of more leftist movements have been kind of essentially modeling themselves after those neoliberal think tanks, but to serve other ideologies. So then you know, you can disembed the form from the ideas, and you can kind of trace this. But in the case that we are looking at, it's really this: we are diffusing an organizational form in, you know, as long as it's embedded within a particular ideology.
Fine. Please, the gentleman in the brown sweater. I'm sorry, I don't know his name.
My name is Bogdan Petrovic. I'm visiting the semester school. Marie-Laure, thank you for a very interesting lecture. And I find the idea of board constructed and diffuse very helpful to think of an organizational phenomenon. And the question is, if you thought of, and what would you think of if we reposition or flip your argument from the idea of emergence of organizational forms, ideas, and whatnot, as diffusion to diffusion as emergence? Because I think it wouldn't help to understand, to account for all the endogenous characteristics of ideas. One idea can be better than another, or one thing from the interpretation of atlases or another, and also the exogenous pressures from different institutional contexts that these think tanks are born into.
Yeah.
Whether we would be able to understand the idea of diffusion as emergence of each small niche of organization within a particular context, where it would help us understand the variability.
So I'm trying to understand you, and you tell me if I'm kind of misinterpreting you. In a sense, what I understand you to say is that we need, the next step is to, from the start, go back to a kind of embeddedness story, in a sense. We need also to understand, it's very fine to have this kind of radiating model of diffusion, but there's still some local emergence, local construction happening, in a sense, where at the interface between, the kind of think tank in Algeria, neoliberal think tank in Algeria, kind of, what happens there concretely? Is that what you're saying, or yeah?
There could be multiple radiations.
Yeah, no, there are multiple radiations, but then you have to look at the multiple embeddedness in parallel. Yeah. No, completely, and that's part of the project. That later on, what we want to do is indeed, have a kind of regional, at least at the beginning, probably European focus really on the kind of parallel construction and embeddedness of this radiating rays, of those rays, basically. So you have all those think tanks being created in that region. What are the patterns of embeddedness that are developing in that period? And so, it's interesting because then you go back to another type of embeddedness studies that is, slightly different from the ones that we're used to. But not so different either, but slightly different probably from the types that we have been used to. But you need to do that too. I completely agree. And part of those embeddedness stories is what I was suggesting at the very end, is about still this transnational community process and mechanism. Because in parallel to this radiating diffusion, what you see in a lot of those stories, the Atlas, the IFRS, I've been also working on competition regulation from that perspective. I mean, I can, several cases like this. You do have this interesting mechanism of constructing a socialization space at the transnational level, where the only objective of that socialization space is to control what happens at the embeddedness level, because you bring in those actors regularly to meet with each other, to benchmark with each other, to discuss with each other, to work with each other, so that you're sure that you align their understanding of the practice, of the form, of the idea, progressively through a kind of socialization mechanism. But that doesn't happen like most socialization mechanism at the local level, it happens at the transnational level. And this is really one of the mechanisms of those embeddedness stories, the new embeddedness types of stories. You would have to take into account those transnational socialization mechanisms that we call the transnational communities. So yes, definitely one of the extension of the project would be to then look more into what's happening on the ground empirically in the different contexts. Mm-hmm.
Yes, I inserted myself.
Yeah.
I couldn't refrain from the opportunity. Brilliant, really, Marie-Laure. First one, general comment and reflection, and then a more specific one. The first has to do with the fact that diffusion studies have a long history in social anthropology, as I'm sure you know as well.
Which I don't know well.
Going back, I mean, a century or even perhaps more, and we have oldies like Franz Boas and Louis Henry Morgan and Rivers and Kroeber and those kinds of people who were early diffusionist theories. They were critiqued even as early as by Malinowski and Radcliffe Brown in the first few decades of the last century for being incapable of dealing with variability and things that were non-convergent and pluralism and all that. And there was also an awakening of the ethnocentric sort of bias inherent in the diffusionist model as it was understood at the time. And then it came back later on and was altered along the lines of a construction model, I would say, by names such as Ulf Hannertz and Thomas Hylland Eriksen and James Ferguson and others. And here we have this explicit attempt not to draw a line between the emergence, the construction of whatever it is,
Good, I have to read this.
an organization, a social form, and the diffusion of that very same phenomenon. And also actually not to draw a line between the diffusion and the construction and the adaptation, the creolization, as they would have it in anthropology terminology. So there is a parallel universe here
Wonderful,
that I think
wonderful.
would be very good for us to explore. So it's also kind of an invitation.
To read, very wonderful.
Also, based on my own fieldwork in Washington, D.C., I can see the neoliberal diffusionist model here. And this is also why I would go along with Patrick suggesting that we look at varieties of diffusion processes. And of course with Stefan, that power is really there. When I studied the Center for Global Development, I learned that it was born as an incubator within the Peterson Institute, a very neoliberal think tank, who spread the idea of the Washington Consensus. Basically, its originator is located there. You need people with substantial amounts of money, you need personal connections, political connections, you need the entire organizational frame. So that would be sort of more or less a replica of the Atlas, even if Atlas, of course, has huge spread across the world to an extent that the Peterson Institute does not entirely have. But there, I would see it as a way in which, not also to avoid ethnocentric generalizing notion. This is the way capitalist modes of organization and ideas get spread. This is a neoliberal way of doing it. Also, partly an American way of doing it, possibly. There are all kinds of sort of cultural organizational specifics here that I think one could explore.
No, I mean, this is very, very helpful. I'll definitely look into this literature from social anthropology, which I was not aware of at all. As I said at the beginning, I'm really sticking to sociology and management science because I know I don't I don't master the other fields. So thank you very much for that, Christina. In terms really, I think, of the power argument, which I see as the main one of the second part of your question, completely, definitely. I take it too much for granted because for me it's obvious in the Atlas case. But obviously I think I need to theorize it. I think it's a very nice thing to theorize it. And I completely agree that this is about an Anglo-Saxonization, not maybe an Americanization, but an Anglo-Saxonization. And that I think really what is at work in the diffusion quark construction is actually probably more dangerous than in the kind of previous diffusion mechanisms, because you have this disembedding that neutralizes the power dimension and turns essentially a kind of ethnocentric Anglo-Saxon view and perspective on the world into a universal view of the world, a transnational view of the world. So, and this is for me very obvious. You know, this is what I've been working on for 20 years in a sense. So, but I don't say it anymore, and I should.
Thank you. So, Fredrik.
I have a background myself in mathematical models of diffusion processes, so I'm trying to fit your ideas into my models. It's not complicated as it may sound, but if you look at Kohlmann's, this classical study of medical innovation, where he was studying how a new drug was spread in the healthcare system, he made the distinction between internal diffusion and external diffusion. Is external diffusion here exactly the same thing as born to diffuse, that this medical company that sort of promote the drug?
Can you tell me what he meant by the difference between internal and external?
Yeah, in internal diffusion, maybe we can change to contagious disease. Internal diffusion is a disease that is spread from person to person.
Okay. Yeah.
And external diffusion may be an infected spring where everyone comes, and so it's point source.
Okay, yeah, there's a point of diffusion. Yeah, okay, no, that makes a lot of sense, yeah. Yeah, would be good. Yeah, would be great. And obviously, interestingly, in epidemiology studies, I mean, again, this is really well beyond my comfort zone, but I'll try nevertheless. in medical epidemiology studies, I think that there is also a parallel to kind of encounter with embeddedness through the kind of mutation notion, you know. So I think that's kind of, you could really run a completely parallel type of thinking. So yes, thank you.
Yes, please.
Thank you for an interesting presentation. Please excuse my ignorance, I'm not well read in diffusion studies, but I've been listening with my rather personal interest in practice theory. And it was a comment that you said about that I'm wondering if you can deliberately diffuse a practice, because like you said, practices are carriers, they're like black boxes, and as I understand, like there are several elements to a practice, and that would assume sort of the mind above it, beyond like technology and artifacts and maybe the teleolfactive structure. And when I was listening to your case of Atlas, because I think it's very interesting, the idea of like practice innovation and how new practices theoretically come into life, or if they're borrowed from other practices. And when I listened to the Atlas case and also the question of what is being diffused, I was wondering if it would be maybe helpful to reframe the argument and think of it as the idea of think tanks is the idea of that is, or the practice itself that is being diffused. And Atlas is sort of part of like an element that sort of supports the practice and gets people engaged into carrying out the practice of coming together and sharing ideas, or whatever that think tank would look like and how you would define the practice. So that was more like my perspective.
I think you can diffuse practices, and I think this is in big part what Atlas is doing, indeed. So Atlas is diffusing an organizational form associated with a set of practices, indeed. And there are different ways in which you can diffuse practices. I mean, obviously you have to move away from tacit, you know, the understanding of practice as something tacit. You have to make it explicit. So this is this embedding thing. So you have first to make it explicit, and then you have to create proper incentives. Okay, I think that if you create proper incentives, you can actually diffuse practices very well. And then actually the other layer of diffusing practices, which they all, you know, they are involved in, and a lot of those born to diffuse spaces are involved in, is what I mentioned before, the socialization. So the kind of socialization mechanisms by which you bring all those people around tables very often, virtual tables or real tables, depending on the thing, and where they exchange on their practices. So one of the very important practice of those think tanks is this idea of, you don't target politicians directly, you target journalists, you target university professors, you target those idea carriers, and you're going to convince them that flat tax is great, you know, for example, that's the types of ideas that you will carry. So for that, you have practices. You organize breakfasts. All of them, they organize those kind of early morning breakfasts with all the journalists and stuff. So, and this is part of the blueprint. It's not only the organizational form, but also the kind of practices are there. And the way in which you can also kind of really diffuse those practices is, again, you bring them together and you say, okay, you are in Czechoslovakia, well, actually in Czech Republic, and you have this think tank there, and you say, well, guys, I've been doing this and it works really well, you know, and oh, why not? I'll try, and then people try and go back, and so you can definitely carry practices, I think, and I think it is a big part of what's happening. Not only formal organization, but also practices. But it takes those different layers, I think. Yeah.
Now, is there anyone who'd like to take the opportunity to ask a last question?
I have one last.
Yes.
One more comment, and that's just from my own perspective, looking at philanthropy. I sort of think that in the Atlas case, it's irrelevant. Just the funding part is probably irrelevant.
It's a huge part of the
thread
practice
to follow, and sort of I'm looking at the lack of accountability of philanthropists in terms of their resource provision in relation to other types of funders, and their specific role in an American society and in a liberal society and Asian societies. And it's probably a spread of that kind of civil society model that is going on, and also the freedom of that money, in terms of the spreading and its interaction with other types of free funding sources that has usually been made on the corporate market locally and then are easily enticed by the model. So
No,
it's a kind of a structuralist resource dependence thread, but just with the glasses I'm carrying right now, I think they probably make up a big part of the story.
This is a very, very good point. I think it's a very valid point. I think that those types of think tanks and their fast diffusion imply somewhere other types of more structural transformations, particularly along the lines of kind of a withering of the state and the welfare state towards more privatized forms of funding for all kinds of things, particularly these types of activities. And so in a sense, it's very difficult to disentangle what comes first, chicken, egg stuff in that case, but the two things are very connected. So you can have those think tanks because you can have those types of funding mechanisms increasingly in our countries, which you could not before. 25 years ago in Europe, fundraising of that kind would be kind of weird. And a lot of the practices that are being diffused are about how you fundraise and how you go about getting money. So here also you have a series of things that are clearly easy to follow in a sense of Atlas helping those different child think tanks in a sense. I like to call Atlas the mother of all the neoliberal think tanks. So helping its children understand how you fundraise in a proper way, which is in essentially an American way. Initially, I'm contradicting myself because there is a place.
Literature on how specific wealthy persons, both Marxist literature and a pluralist sort of very normative literature on how wealthy persons took on different think tanks in the United States Pew Institute, and started to spread their ideas. It's all very empirically documented in terms of other funding.
It's interesting because from my take of the subject, it's the country. It's actually hard. The think tanks, and especially the kind of neoliberal architecture, was smart enough to co-opt rich. So I think it's probably somewhere in between to co-opt them into their own ideas. So it's an interesting, definitely somewhere in between. Yeah.
All right. So again, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure having you.
Thank you very much. Very helpful.